What if the planet's largest tectonic ledger has been rewritten this year, and the single most alarming footnote is the absence of one expected line? What does it mean when the Pacific Plate, whose margins have long written the world's largest earthquakes, comes alive in remote corners from the far north to the far south, while the western rim that hugs the United States remains conspicuously quiet? Is the silence along the west coast a relief or a hidden warning sign that strain is being banked rather than spent? The short, sharp answer from the geological toolbox is that the plate is moving, stresses are being redistributed, and the mechanisms that control where and how that energy is released are not random. They are governed by subduction dynamics, slab geometry, fault coupling, and stress transfer. The longer answer, and the one this video pursues, is that during 2025 the Pacific Plate has experienced an unusually concentrated series of very large ruptures and clusters of seismicity in regions that reveal active megathrust behavior, trench interactions, and abrupt changes in slab strength. Yet the zone along the continental margin of the northeastern Pacific that historically carries very large ruptures remains unusually quiescent. That absence is itself a geological observation with implications, and the remainder of this article examines the physical processes that could explain the pattern and why the quiet may be the most critical clue of all. The data for 2025 read like a plate tectonic map of extreme behavior. A rupture of magnitude 8.8 on the megathrust along the Kuril-Kamchatka convergent margin opened the year's roster of dominant events, producing an energetic sequence of aftershocks that extended the stress and deformation field across the subduction interface. That event, an enormous release of seismic moment concentrated on a shallow thrust plane, produced both static offsets and strong near-field shaking, demonstrating classical megathrust mechanics. One overriding plate suddenly slipped past a downgoing slab after sustained interplate coupling. A cascade of other very large earthquakes followed on the Pacific Plate system in disparate regions. Interplate thrust events in the northwest near Kamchatka and Japan, large thrust ruptures in the Southern Ocean around the Drake Passage, and significant strike-slip and oblique events in the western Pacific Islands and Alaska, producing a 12-month footprint of redistributed strain. That is markedly different from the comparative quiet of 2024, when the count of magnitude 7 and above events was far lower, and the largest event that year was magnitude 7.5. In short, 2025 has been a year of focused, high-magnitude release on the plate margins, except along the eastern rim adjacent to the North River for much of the Pacific margin. Where the downgoing slab is old and dense, slab pull is strong. The slab sinks faster and imposes tensile and shear stresses on the hinge region and on adjacent plates. Conversely, viscous coupling between the slab and ambient mantle, buoyant anomalies in the slab, or slab stagnation, can reduce effective slab pull and change stress fields. Ridge push, the lateral gravitational force generated by elevated mid-ocean ridges, contributes as well, but is generally secondary for the Pacific Plate because of its large size and the powerful slabs that border it. Mantle flow, variable slab buoyancy, and even interaction with deep mantle heterogeneities modulate those forces and therefore where strain accumulates and how it gets released. In subduction zones, the megathrust interface between the overriding plate and the downgoing slab is the principal site of energy storage and release. That interface is not uniformly coupled. Some segments are strongly locked, meaning elastic strain accumulates across centuries and is released episodically in great earthquakes, while other segments are creeping or populated by slow slip events that dissipate strain more steadily without large seismic radiation. The geometry and roughness of the interface, asperities, seamounts, sediment thickness, and local rheology determine whether strain concentrates in localized patches or is distributed over broad areas. In the Kuril-Kamchatka case, the rupture that produced magnitude 8.8 likely nucleated and propagated along a broad, strongly coupled segment of the megathrust, encountering large asperities and releasing accumulated elastic strain in a major impulsive event. The subsequent aftershock cloud and repeated large events in the region this year indicate that the regional plate boundary was primed, either by long-term coupling or by recent transient stress increases into conditions favourable for large rupture propagation. Mechanically, the difference between single very large megathrust ruptures and swarms of smaller large events can be traced to rupture propagation dynamics and the way slip heterogeneity organises across the interface. A megathrust rupture becomes very large when a propagating slip front can traverse multiple asperities without being arrested by zones of lower coupling or by geometric barriers like bends in the trench or sudden changes in plate convergence vector. The physics of rupture propagation depend on available elastic strain energy, frictional properties of the fault surface, rate and state behavior, and dynamic processes such as thermal pressurization and fluid pressurization that can transiently reduce friction and enable rapid slip. When dynamic weakening occurs, for example, by sudden pore fluid overpressure that reduces effective normal stress, rupture can accelerate and outrun arresting heterogeneities. The result is an energetic release like Kamchatka's magnitude 8.8, where both static displacement and radiated seismic energy are extraordinarily large. Large events also rearrange the surrounding stress field. Static Coulomb stress changes transfer load across faults, increasing failure likelihood in some regions while reducing it in others. Dynamic stresses, transient stress pulses carried by seismic waves can trigger remote events by nudging faults already close to failure. In a large subduction rupture, the near-field coseismic loading can increase stress on adjacent patches of the plate interface or on nearby crustal faults, sometimes producing aftershocks or triggered earthquakes at considerable distances. The pattern of subsequent macroscopic seismicity thus carries a signal of both where strain was released and where residual stress was boosted. 2025's catalogue shows that very large ruptures in Kamchatka and neighbouring arcs were followed by extended sequences of aftershocks and additional large events in the region, consistent with classical stress transfer and readjustment on an active margin. Yet a plate-scale redistribution of stress raises the question, where did the energy go that might otherwise have found expression along the northeastern rim? The western United States sits astride a hybrid margin dominated by a long history of transform and subduction transitions, the Cascadia subduction zone to the northwest, the transform San Andreas system to the south, and these structures are powered by the same Pacific plate motions that animate the Kuril-Kamchatka and Japan margins. Historically, Cascadia's megathrust segments lock and release on timescales of centuries, producing rare but enormous earthquakes. The Northern California and Oregon regions around Cape Mendocino host complex interactions between the Mendocino triple junction, subducting fragments, and transform motion that have historically generated large events. The expectation, based on plate motion, seismic potential, and long-term geodetic strain accumulation, is that at least some parts of this eastern rim remain candidates for large ruptures. In 2025, however, the Western continental margin has not produced a comparably large magnitude 7 or above rupture in the same abundance as other Pacific margins, even though the plate as a whole has been active elsewhere. That absence is the anomaly this investigation highlights, a plate that is otherwise unloading strain in high-magnitude events, but leaving the US West Coast unusually quiet. There are several physical mechanisms by which one margin's activity can suppress or delay rupture on another. One possibility is stress shadowing. When one large rupture relieves stress in a spatial pattern that includes a reduction of shear or Coulomb stress on a distant, critically stressed fault, the likelihood of immediate failure there decreases. Conversely, if the remote rupture increases static stress on a continental boundary, it can promote rupture. Which outcome occurs depends on slip geometry, relative positions, and intervening structures. For the Pacific Plate, a series of large ruptures concentrated in the northwest and southern sectors could, through their static stress signatures, reduce the immediate failure potential on certain eastern rim segments, while increasing it on others. In other words, the plate does not behave as a collection of independent fault segments. It is an interconnected elastic system where large releases in one place change the failure threshold elsewhere. Another possibility is that the nature of the eastern rim faults themselves is different. A higher degree of aseismic creep or distributed viscoelastic relaxation may be dissipating strain in ways that produce lower seismic moments, even while geodetic velocities show ongoing plate motion. The subduction interface beneath Cascadia is sediment-rich and relatively young in places, and sediments can act to decouple plates or to localize slow slip. If a greater portion of plate convergence is being accommodated by slow slip or by plastic deformation within the upper plate and lower crust, then fewer large seismic ruptures will be observed, even though strain continues to be imposed. That said, the historical record of Cascadia and parts of Northern California suggests substantial locked patches remain. The current lull, therefore, is not plainly explained by uniform creeping behavior. Viscoelastic relaxation in the mantle wedge and lower crust offers a further mechanism. The mantle and lower crust respond to coseismic stress changes and to long-term loading by flowing on decadal to centennial timescales. If the mantle beneath the eastern rim is undergoing accelerated relaxation, perhaps driven by thermal anomalies or by past large events altering viscosity, the result could be a redistribution of stresses that temporarily relieves loading on locked megathrust patches and delays earthquake nucleation. This would produce an apparent lull in large seismicity, even though deeper, longer-term deformation continues. Dynamic triggering must also be considered. Large earthquakes generate long-range seismic waves that can perturb fault systems thousands of kilometers away. These transient stress pulses can bring marginally stressed faults to failure or, more subtly, can perturb pore pressures and the frictional state over time. The pattern observed this year, large thrust ruptures in Kamchatka and Japan, followed by clustered activity in the Southern Ocean and in island arcs, shows how dynamic and static processes can combine to produce a complex pattern of clustered ruptures. However, the absence of a triggered event on the west coast suggests that either the dynamic pulses produce stress changes unfavourable to rupture there, or that the west coast faults were not in a near-critical state, amenable to immediate triggering. The crucial point is that remote large events do not guarantee synchronous ruptures along every plate margin. The response is conditioned by local stress state, fault strength, and geometry. A closer look at the Kuril-Kamchatka sequence illustrates the interplay of these mechanisms. The magnitude 8.8 rupture occurred on a megathrust with shallow depth and significant slip, a profile that concentrates slip near the trench and maximizes tsunami potential. Such an event releases massive elastic strain, but also imparts large Coulomb stress changes in the down dip and along strike directions. The aftershock distribution and later magnitude 7 and above events in the adjacent regions indicate that the rupture did not simply relieve strain and stop, but instead reorganize the regional load, potentially transferring stress into adjacent patches and enabling further ruptures. That cascade is a classic signature of a dynamic, highly coupled margin. By contrast, parts of the eastern rim may have experienced marginally reduced stress in the immediate aftermath, pushing failure thresholds upward rather than downward. In this context, the West Coast quiet is not an indicator of safety, but of temporary suppression, an observation that must be weighed against long-term coupling and paleoseismic records that still demand attention. At the level of fault mechanics, asperity size and distribution are pivotal. Large earthquakes tend to occur where broad, high-strength asperities exist because these are the places where elastic strain is concentrated over long periods. When asperities are large and contiguous, ruptures can propagate extensively. When they are segmented by weak zones or bathymetric features, ruptures may stall and produce smaller events. The Pacific Plate's margins differ markedly in asperity structure. Some arcs display continuous, strongly coupled interfaces. Others are interrupted by complex plate junction geometry, C-mounts, and variable sediment supply that make the interface patchy. The Western continental margin includes both long stretches of potential large asperities and complex geometric features where rupture behavior is uncertain. Current seismological and geodetic observations suggest that asperities on the west coast are present and capable of hosting large ruptures, which heightens the concern that the absence of recent large seismic release signals the build-up of elastic strain rather than its resolution. The energy budget perspective helps translate these mechanical ideas into probabilistic expectations. Earthquake hazard is not purely a matter of immediate cause and effect. It is about how elastic strain energy accumulates and is budgeted across the plate interface and crust. When one part of a system relieves energy through a large rupture, the energy budget elsewhere changes. Some of the energy that would otherwise contribute to rupture nucleation may be expended by viscous flow, Aseismic slip, or redistributed through stress changes. Thus, the plate's current pattern, heavy release at certain margins and quiescence along the eastern rim, can be interpreted as an energy redistribution scenario in which some margins are shedding accumulated energy while others are either being temporarily relieved or silently storing it for a future release. Geodetic observations, global positioning system, and interferometric synthetic aperture radar measurements are central to diagnosing whether quietness equates to strain accumulation. Where continuous GPS networks show persistent convergence across a locked interface, the geological expectation is that strain energy is accumulating. If instead Geodesy shows reduced coupling or episodic slow slip, then aseismic processes may be taking up motion. For the Pacific Plate margins under scrutiny, remote geodetic datasets indicate continued plate convergence in broad terms, but the fine-scale partitioning of slip between seismic and aseismic processes remains complex and spatially variable. In many places, the data are consistent with ongoing locking interspersed with short-lived transient slips. In others, slow slip episodes accommodate a significant fraction of the motion. Interpreting such mixed signals is the central challenge of present-day tectonics. The coupling parameter is not binary, but a continuum that evolves through time in response to thermal state, fluid pressure, and prior rupture history. If one had to synthesize the mechanistic explanation for the in-plate pattern observed in 2025, it would be this. Variable coupling and slab dynamics produced large, efficient ruptures in the northwestern and southern sectors of the Pacific Plate, enabling major energy release there. Those ruptures, by static and dynamic stress transfer, rearranged the stress field in ways that did not immediately favor large rupture along the continental west coast. Simultaneous aseismic processes and mantle rheology in the eastern rim may have absorbed some of the imposed motion. The net result is a temporarily quiescent but still potentially hazardous corridor along the western United States, where strain may be accumulating unseen. Each of these elements, slab pull variability, megathrust coupling heterogeneity, stress transfer, dynamic triggering, and viscoelastic relaxation, are standard pieces of plate tectonic mechanics. Yet their particular combination this year creates an anomalous fingerprint worth special scrutiny. There is also an important nuance about seismic catalogues and the definition of activity. A single large earthquake in a remote arc, because of its enormous moment release, can dominate the seismic energy budget for the year, while leaving continental margins with no comparably large events. That does not make the continental margins inactive in a mechanical sense. It simply means that in calendar-limited snapshots, activity may concentrate where conditions happened to permit rupture propagation. From a process viewpoint, the lack of a large West Coast rupture this year reduces immediate seismic moment release in that region, thereby increasing the elastic strain that remains stored in the crust and on the megathrust if the fault is indeed locked. Thus, counting events alone is insufficient. Assessing coupling, monitoring slow slip transients, and quantifying stress changes are necessary to interpret the implication of absence. Finally, the temporal interplay of seismic cycles matters. Earthquake cycles operate at multiple timescales. The seismic cycle of locked segments occurs over centuries to millennia. Transient slow-slip events operate on days to years. Mantle flow and viscoelastic relaxation operate on years to centuries. The observed pattern in 2025 is a snapshot within this spectrum. It is entirely plausible from a mechanical standpoint that the West Coast will remain quiet for years if more energy is taken up by aseismic processes. It is equally plausible that current stress transfer and prior strain accumulation have primed certain asperities such that a large rupture could occur with relatively little warning from the seismic catalogue alone. The geological imperative is to continue monitoring geodesy, seismicity, and seismic noise, to refine the state of coupling and to identify precursory slow-slip or foreshock sequences that are sometimes associated with large ruptures. In a nutshell, the Pacific Plate's 2025 behavior, the emergence of very large ruptures in the Kuril-Kamchatka arc, the Southern Ocean, Japan, and other margins, combined with the relative quiet of the US West Coast, presents a coherent tectonic story when read through the mechanics of subduction, slab dynamics, fault coupling, and stress transfer. The absence of a large West Coast rupture this year is not a benign datum. It is a diagnostic observation that must be interpreted in the context of interplate coupling, mantle rheology, and the redistribution of elastic strain. Whether that absence signals a temporary suppression due to stress shadows and viscous relaxation, or a looming release due to accumulated elastic energy, depends on local coupling and on how the plate system evolves over the coming months and years. From a purely geological perspective, the missing event on the continental rim is the most critical clue. It forces a reassessment of strain budgeting on the Pacific plate, emphasizes the non-local consequences of megathrust ruptures, and underscores that quiet does not equal safety in a complex elastic plate system. The science must therefore focus on resolving the fine-scale mechanics of coupling and on quantifying stress changes across the plate if the tectonic narrative of 2025 is to be fully understood. If you found this breakdown helpful, don't forget to like the video, share it with others who follow Earth science updates, and hit that subscribe button for more deep dive investigations. And make sure to tap that hype icon. It really helps push this video out to a wider audience and keeps the channel growing. Thank you for the support.